So without further ado, I continued packing, after which I set myself on my bed for the rest of her abstinence. As so often, I rang with myself about the most successful structure to use for asking her something. After all, I couldn't just confront her with keywords. That rather concluded in a misunderstanding, so I quickly laid that aside and dedicated myself to the perfect sentence. And my teacher would have been proud of me. But however, after a couple of minutes have passed, I noted some kind of noise outside my room, which I presumed to be Chloe and also supposedly Jessica. So as a consequence, I called out loudly when I heard the doorknob being activated. "Hey, Dr. Bush." I was astonished due to his appearance, because I already thought about initiating the conversation with Chloe. But his visit was only logical, since he brought me the last information about my departure taking place on the following day. But primarily he asked me if I had wrapped everything up. After I greeted him politely, but yet in surprise, I confirmed his question. Afterwards, he continued with his main objective. He laid it into my hands, I looked at it, and deposited it directly on my bedside table. He already claimed that it was only a sheet given to me pro forma, because in order to read something on that, I had to pass a couple of years at university in the subject of medicine. So without any attempts to decipher anything, I turned toward the doctor once more to say him a little goodbye and a thank you in advance, since he and his team managed to avoid any possible long-term damage, and I was very grateful for that. It was unimaginable to walk around with such a scar displaying a swath of destruction in my face, and even better, there was no internal damage either. But anyway, as Dr. Bush brought up more words, I noticed that his further endeavors were not by any means about medicine. Surprisingly, he asked me about the connection with Chloe. "And how do you get along with your roommate?" At first he hit me off guard, but then I just conceded and gave him the truth, according to which we had become an amazing team. "That's always nice to hear," he replied with a stretched smile. "So have you already said goodbye to her?" "For now, yes, but we made arrangements to maintain our friendship. I already promised to return and visit her." I took over his smile as a consequence, to prove the honesty with which I said it. But he only stood there and gazed at me with the hugest eyes I've ever seen. Then he stared at the floor. "Dr. Bush?" I awoke him from his daydream he presumably had fallen into. "Yes, Aaron, that's great news, but do you know that... How do you come home? Will your parents pick you up, or have you hired a cab service?" Severely unnerved due to his behavior, I referred to the last message I shared with my parents, in which they consent to pick me up. I informed him about the latest status, according to which they came when they knew the exact time of my release. With that, I indirectly alluded to the question when I was going to be released. When he noticed my intention, he rang for words again. The time, 11 o'clock is the time your bed should be ready for reuse. So about 10:30 at the latest, I guess. I just nodded and thanked him eventually, before he almost tried to escape. "Yeah, then I wish you well, and I think we both hope that we don't see each other that soon. But when you meet Chloe again, I guess we will sooner or later." Without waiting for my response, he left, and I witnessed one last time those huge heavy eyes that really scared me. But even more scary was the fact that I didn't understand it again. Not gonna joke. Later on, I will look at this facility as Riddle Rock Hospital, but with a heart decorating the facade of that room Chloe and I were kept in. But anyway, though I couldn't decipher his sentences between the lines, I shifted my focus quickly to my next task, which dealt with informing my parents about the time they came to pick me up. I did it via WhatsApp, so I was done with it quite fast. After all, there was nothing left for me to do or to arrange. I cleaned my bed, my cupboard, basically everything regarding the last moments of my stay in the hospital, and thus I had time again to think. As I came back to the core contents of my thoughts before Dr. Bush interrupted me, I considered also the edges. What I mean by that? The core consisted of the main questions I intended to ask Chloe and the corresponding formulations. But I dedicated not a single thought as to when it was the best point of time to do that. I mean, I just could ask her right away without anything further, but rather I desired to create a certain atmosphere, a warm, happy atmosphere, in which she was more likely to open herself towards me. And straight from the beginning, there was basically only one situation or circumstance that I evaluated as perfect for achieving the points on my checklist: our last Uno session. Unlike the day before, I definitely wanted to catch up with that, since there would be something missing otherwise. Even though we had contact and intimacy ad infinitum, it was something polluting the light, crystal clear air. And my aim was to figure out what that was. Also, because I wouldn't be there to take her sorrow away directly. So for the following minutes, I constructed a game plan for the approaching evening, consisting of certainties as well as eventualities. Some things I could predict to some extent, but others were still so out of reach, as if I didn't know her whatsoever. So my level of nervousness was quite high when I noticed first signs of her appearance, although we were still hours away from the mentioned evening. I just hoped that she opened herself just enough in order for me to help properly. I mean, I could be anyone with any profession, even the profession friend, but as long as she didn't give me access, I was powerless, and I desired to change that. So as she acclimatized herself again to the quiet air inside our room, we dealt primarily with superficial topics, like further class trips, my grades, and so on. All in all, we were still far away from the topic regarding next day. It almost seemed like we avoided it on purpose. But as time flew by, we came more and more into the urge to mention what had to be mentioned. And I initiated this talk about the self-declared duty. Chloe, there is something I want to speak with you about. First of all, would you like to arrange one last Uno session with me? Certainly, that was the easiest question of those I had prepared, but it should lead me to those coming next. Also, it was one I anticipated the outcome, which was indeed a clear yes. So in the usual manner, I walked to her side and sat onto the bed, basically right next to her, so that we already had a little bit of physical contact. With that achieved, without any further issues, my next aim was to transcend that contact into a mental one. So to say, a trustworthy connection from one to another, with no obstacles interfering us, and just speaking about anything burdening us. So before we start, I want to ask you something else. And it is about tomorrow, but also about yesterday. And in advance, forgive me when I dig straight into a nest of wasps. She said nothing, so I continued quickly before I lost my built-up momentum. We know each other for 1 week now, and whether or not you can trust me lies in your hands. So I just want to let you know that you can speak with me about anything that weighs you down, no matter what it is, or if it seems embarrassing somehow. I'm here for you, like you were for me lately. It doesn't have to be now, but when you decide to do it, you can come to me at any time, even when it means that we are on the phone for hours. Admittedly, that last sentence was added in spontaneity and seemed like a try-hard attempt to get her phone number. But it was neither my actual motive, nor did she evaluate it as such, for she only looked at me and lowered her eyebrows slightly while smiling. As she took my hand to her, she replied silently, barely audible. I guess you're alluding to the last night, Aaron. I really appreciate what you said. I feel that it originates from your heart. But now I want you to just trust me. There is indeed something that screams to be heard by you, but for the sake of us both, please simply trust me. I will explain it to you. While she begged for unconditional trust, she grabbed my second hand, so that I completely lost grip on the cards I had mangled halfways. Seconds later, I stroked her left cheek with my right hand and calmed her, while also lowering my voice. As I said, it should happen when you are ready for it, and until then, I'm going to trust you. As a consequence, she held onto my hand and stared with her moist eyes into mine. The fact that she was smiling from one ear to another was truly a huge relief for me, because I conveyed my point without intimidating her. And also we managed to strengthen our bond even more to from then on a kind of heart-to-heart connection for which I longed for in advance. In fact, all I wanted was letting her know that she could trust me without the urge to explain everything precisely within one sudden conversation. She certainly had reasons for holding something back, but unconditional trust implies that I accepted it as it was and just left the power to decide completely to her. After all, that's the parallelism of a true relationship. Unconditional love, unconditional trust, unconditional support. And that exactly was what I applied back then, as we just shared this familiar moment with time standing still. Although it seemed like not much time had passed until we finally started playing, the clock spoke differently. Another indication that time didn't exist while I was around Chloe, and in that manner behaved the rest of that evening. Since we started quite early, due to my departure not too many hours later, we agreed on calling it a day when the clock showed 11 p.m. But nevertheless, we had our 6 to 7 hours fun with that trivial card game. When Chloe gave me eventually the cards to deposit them inside the red case, she already conveyed the lethargic energy of goodbye, which would be relevant particularly on the day following. She didn't need to say that, because I felt it. I felt how she felt, and it was the same feeling I felt as well. When I laid the card game inside and closed the box, I initiated my first intention, a la please never forget me, while handing out the game set to Chloe. I could tell by her reaction that she was caught completely off guard, as she just stared at me with her forehead lowered. What? She wondered. Keep the cards, as proof that I will keep my promise. This time she used that shy thank you, which had become usual for me when I was rescued from those predicaments I mostly maneuvered myself into. But unlike that, it happened within a totally different light, so to say. Normally the feeling of relief was involved, but this time it was, well, love. I had no other words for that. That could also have been the cause that I kind of anticipated her reaction, for it matched perfectly with my expectation. She interpreted that exactly like I wanted her to. Once more, that mutual understanding was key. She didn't saw it as goodbye, but rather as a soon welcome back. And it was my main objective to clarify that. Not like usually, when she said she understood me, but somehow was burdened with something else. Instead, I wanted to gain tangible, physical, nonverbal evidence on that. Otherwise, she would be drowning in sorrow again, as I've experienced firsthand. Even though I was far away from being sure that it had something to do with me, I saw myself highly responsible, at least for pulling her out of those situations. And that made it so important for her to understand me, since I wouldn't be available for a couple of days. And those days presented space for many things to happen. My desire for clarity was slaked, as I saw by her reaction following the reaction. She approached me more and more, and ultimately was so close that she whispered into my ear, "Aaron, you're amazing." But that was only the minor proof. Within the major one, she pressed her lips against my cheek, held them for a couple of seconds in that pose, and returned to a more neutral position. Admittedly, that was a reaction I never ever could have anticipated. I mean, that nice lovely words and everything surrounding that were still new terrain for me, in particular with the girl. And in those terms, I almost lost myself completely when I noticed what she was doing. She gave me a little kiss, and that made me feel as if I reached every single goal in my life. Everything I wanted was achieved in those very seconds. As a consequence of that massive inflow of euphoria and elation into my system, I almost forgot my second plan, my second indicator, let's call it proof, I wanted to give her. Somehow I played with the thought to give it to her in the next morning, because I didn't want to overstretch it, but something pushed me to do it anyway.